All right, welcome back. I hope you guys had a blessed Easter and you had a nice break with your family. Obviously, we've been with our families all the time, but hopefully Easter it was a special time for everyone, and I certainly appreciated the Triduum. And even though it was weird not being at Mass, we were able to watch a lot of beautiful services from all over the country. So hopefully you had a similar experience and now we're back at it. I want to try to ease back into things a little bit, so I'm hoping this is going to be a bit of a shorter lecture, primarily because I know you guys are still working on your take-home tests. So I'm going to try to make this kind of short and sweet. Just a couple of administrative notes before we dive in. So your take-home test, you'll be watching this on Tuesday, the what is it, the 14th. So your test is due Wednesday by the end of the day, and that should. I had a little bit of an issue with RenWeb; they weren't allowing me to upload the test, but I was able to get that cleared up. I did email it to you as an attachment, and there was a couple of questions on how to what kind of format that you should use. You can either take that document that I made up and you can just handwrite it, and obviously in very legibly in complete sentences. And if you want to take a picture or scan each page, you can do that. Or you can just create another document, a Word document, or something like that. So you would type out the answers and then just use the questions, from the test. So either way, and then you can uh, either one, you would upload it to the homework drop feature on RenWeb. So that's due Wednesday. So hopefully you're working on that. Um, we usually have a live session on Fridays, but I'm not going to be able to be here on Friday live. I'm going to have a lecture for you to watch, but I'm not going to be able to do a live session on Friday. And actually, I've had some requests from parents to maybe um, change up a bit of the classes for freshmen so they're not all on Friday, those live sessions. So I think after this week, I'd like to move our live session to the middle of the week, which would be Wednesday, but not this week. Okay, so and I'll point that out to you at live forum on Wednesday morning. But if you're watching this Tuesday, just know that no live session Wednesday or Friday of this week because I have a conflict on Friday and I don't want to surprise people on Wednesday. Okay, but moving forward, the following week, I'd like to move our live session to Wednesday at 12:30 as opposed to Friday at 12:30. Let's see. You're going to need that book, Plutarch's Lives. We're going to start reading basically biographies from that book. The first one will be due on Friday. You'll be reading the biography of Cato the Elder. So you need to get those out. And if you can't find it, or if if you don't have it with you, let me know. You can pick it up at school. I can get Mrs. DiAgostino to make that arrangement. So just let me know on that. So this lecture is covering material from page 642 to 648 in Bauer. This is the remainder of chapter 74. So it picks up the story after the after the destruction of after the Second Macedonian War, essentially, which was when was that? Yeah, it was basically it got us to the end of Hannibal and the Battle of Thermopylae Pass. That's right. So anyway, so this picks up the story from there, and it'll move us to about 165 BC. And one of the major themes is that Rome is expanding and growing and continuing to butt heads against the Macedonians and the Seleucids. And really, by the end of this period, Rome is going to be pushing back on all fronts there. So, again, as a way of kind of expediting things, this is kind of my whiteboard for tonight. So we've got the Third Macedonian War. Poor Perseus. We'll talk about Perseus. We'll talk about the Macedonians being crushed by Rome at the Battle of Pydna, and then the end of the Macedonian monarchy. So that's the first set of topics that we'll discuss. So if you remember, one of the ways that Rome was trying to keep the Macedonians in line was taking one of their um, one of the sons of the emperor Philip V and taking them as hostage. So that actually did happen. Demetrius was the son, and Rome, as a sign of goodwill, released Demetrius back to Macedonia. But in the meantime, while he was gone, one of his younger brothers, his name was Perseus, he had gotten used to being kind of the heir apparent. He didn't know when Demetrius was going to be back, and so he was not pleased by the return of Perseus. And so what happens is he convinces his old man, Philip V, his old father, to actually, he convinces him that Perseus has gone native, has become more Roman than Macedonian. And as a result, Philip V actually has his eldest son, Demetrius, poisoned for being quote unquote disloyal. This was in 181 BC, which was about the same time that Hannibal was meeting his fate. 2 years later, in 179 BC, Philip V ends up dying, and Perseus becomes the new king of Macedonia. At that point, he begins planning a new invasion of Greece. This is against the wishes of Rome. He ends up marrying one of the daughters of the Seleucid emperor, and as a result of a power struggle inside the Seleucid Empire, a man by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV, ends up emerging from the power struggle as the new emperor of the Seleucid Empire. So you basically have two new emperors in the kind of the eastern part of Europe and the western part of Asia. You have Perseus in Macedonia and Antiochus IV in the Seleucid Empire. Antiochus was supposed to be a regent, kind of a caretaker until a younger son was able to be of age to take over. But he had the younger son that he was acting as regent for murdered. So a lot of kind of palace intrigue going on in both Macedonia and the Seleucid Empire. And so what ends up happening is Perseus decides to, instead of making this kind of a showy, flashy invasion of Greece, he ends up kind of moving his troops and his army kind of stealthily and without a lot of grand fanfare, as well as not laying any real big sieges to these towns in northern Greece, but basically kind of shows up, encourages them to form an alliance, and this is what ends up happening. And by by about 173, word gets back to Rome that Macedonia and under Perseus is causing trouble. And at this point, Rome has had enough. This is the third time they've been trying to kind of deal with what they think is an occupied country. And so they send, in 171 BC, they sent 17,000 troops to Macedonia. It was a 3-year conflict, lasts from 171 to 168 BC, with only one real momentous and decisive battle, and this is the Battle of Pydna, Pydna, which is right there. If you see that on the map, the map is, let's look really close there. There you go. And the map is on page 644. And after that battle, Rome ends up breaking Macedonia into 4 separate provinces. Perseus is hauled back to Rome as a permanent hostage. There's no temporary hostage. And this ends the Macedonian monarchy that had produced Alexander the Great. So really, By 168 BC, Macedonia is no more. It's not an independent nation anymore, and it is a part of the growing. We're not calling it an empire yet because it's still the republic, but it's a growing sphere of influence of the Roman Republic. So that's the first topic there, the Third Macedonian War. Second topic is the Maccabean Revolt. Okay, and this has to do, the Maccabees were a Jewish rebel force that ends up taking on the Seleucid Empire, who had been marching through that area, trying to reclaim part of its lost territory to Egypt. So we're going to talk about the Maccabean Revolt, which and also just the internal workings of the Seleucid Empire and the Egyptian, the Ptolemaic monarchy in Egypt. And remember, Macedonia, the Seleucid Empire, and also the Ptolemaic monarchy in Egypt were all these partitions of the old Alexandrian, Alexander the Great's conquering of really East Asia. So you can see what's happening is that portions of this are being either stripped from their reign or becoming part of this new Roman Empire. Again, we're not going to say it, but that's what really it's starting to look like. All right, so that's the so we're going to look at the Maccabean Revolt now. So we mentioned Antiochus IV. He's the new emperor of the Seleucid Empire, and he wants some of the territory back that Egypt had taken from him as they were fighting the Romans. And so they call this area Chale, Syria, the heart of Syria. These were places like Israel, Judah, and then Syria proper. So it's basically what we would think of as Palestine, the modern day country of Israel today, the Palestinian Authority, Lebanon, and then part of modern day Syria, which of course is going through a horrific civil war at this time. Now, this is going on about between 170 and 160 BC, so roughly around the same time as the Third Macedonian War. And Rome obviously is preoccupied with that area of the world, Macedonia, but they don't like the idea of the Seleucids trying to, take advantage of Rome being occupied with that matter to take over part of the southeastern part of the Mediterranean Sea. So they actually sent envoys to Antiochus. He had begun to lay siege to Alexandria, which was the capital of the Ptolemaic monarchy in Egypt. Told them he better stop doing what he's doing, or they're going to march against him. And so Antiochus kind of chickens out, takes his forces before they were able to actually move into Alexandria and force a settlement. He starts to march back from the Nile Delta north, hugging the Mediterranean coast and going through present-day Israel. And at that point, he ends up going into the temple in Jerusalem and spoiling it, basically committing sacrilege, sacrificing to idols and to foreign gods, and stole a lot of the Jewish treasury, both in Jerusalem and other towns in the area. And he actually kept a garrison of troops in Jerusalem to kind of keep order and power within that area. But here's the thing that he did that kind of broke the camel's back, so to speak, is that he didn't really understand this Jewish religion, this idea of Yahweh and a covenant between Abraham and all of that. They just thought, well, one religion's just like any other. They were polytheistic, and they had adopted multiple gods from both the Persian kind of pantheon, but also the Greeks with their gods as well. And so he ended up forcing the Jews to worship Zeus and also to give sacrifice to Antiochus himself as kind of a demigod. And at this point, the Jews refuse, they freak out. There was actually a story of women in the book of Maccabees, women with babies at their breasts being thrown off a cliff. So this is terrible, terrible stuff. And the Jews end up deciding enough is enough, and they end up forming a rebellion behind the efforts of a group of brothers, with the eldest being Judas. And Judas ends up becoming a freedom fighter, and he's nicknamed Judas Maccabeus or Judas the Hammer. And so it ends up not toppling the Seleucid Empire within Israel, but it does kind of push back, or it stops them from imposing their religious kind of edicts on the Jewish people themselves. And what an interesting, wouldn't call it a side note, but an interesting development that we need to kind of keep an eye on is that much in the same way that I would say, before Rome was a sworn enemy to Carthage, they were actually allies, and it was actually Carthage fighting Syracuse that was the real problem. Here, they actually signed a league of friendship, the Jewish people, with the Romans. They looked at the Romans as a way of, maybe being an ally against the Seleucid Empire. And so this effort, this combination of this revolt led by Judas Maccabeus, as well as this friendship with Rome, kind of prevented the worst kind of exploitation on the part of the Seleucids. And then you actually get this is where we get the whole festival of Hanukkah. This is at the bottom of page 646. Let me just read you a little bit of this. He says, the books of 1 and 2 Maccabees are historical accounts in the Apocrypha, a set of biblical books which falls between the Old and New Testaments in the Christian Bible. And there's some debate between Catholics and Protestants about whether those books should be counted as part of the sacred text or not. Most Protestants reject these books. Catholics accept them. In 165 BC, Judas managed to, and this is according to the book of Maccabees, Judas managed to bring the temple back under Jewish control and set about ritually purifying it. The altar had been defiled in the worship of Zeus by having a pig sacrificed on it. According to 1 Maccabees, the purification was finished and the temple rededicated in December 164 BC, an event celebrated by the later Jewish festival of Hanukkah. According to the Talmud, which is a collection of written elaborations on the central texts of Judaism, kind of an interpretation, the Maccabees did not have enough pure olive oil to use in the purification rituals, but the single flask that they used burned miraculously for 8 days. So that's where you get the festival of Hanukkah, this whole episode where the Jewish people are trying to resist and basically fighting for religious freedom, which is something they were doing for a long time. Now, again, you don't get Israel becoming an independent nation or independent country at this point, but Demetrius the First, who had kind of learned the lesson from some of these other Seleucid emperors, granted Judas's brother Jonathan a fair amount of freedom to govern the Jews as he saw fit. This is the top of 647, as long as he remained a faithful subject of the empire. Jonathan behaved himself, quote unquote, with great circumspection, meaning that he was not a freedom-fighting hothead like his older brother. And so they left the Jews alone. So this episode, the takeaway is that A, you see how important religious freedom is to the Jewish people. B, you see the beginnings of an interest by Rome in this part of the world, and just having gone through the whole Holy Week and hearing of Pilate and the Roman kind of garrison inside of Jerusalem. Basically, the Romans later end up becoming the replacements of the Seleucid Empire in the face of Jewish opposition. Okay, final topic is this idea of the Latin language becoming the official language of Italy. So the first is we're going to talk a little bit about Cumae and Campania and how they petitioned Rome to become the official language. Talk a little bit about what that meant, and then some political reforms that end up taking place by the end of this period. And we're talking about 160 BC is where we're going to kind of get up to. All right, so we know the whole term civitas sine suffragio, basically citizenship without the vote, and Rome had been using that and expanding that concept after the Second Punic War. Well, not only were they granting people within the Italian peninsula of this kind of quasi-citizenship status, but then there were basically people who regions of Italy that wanted more of a connection with between themselves and the Roman state. And so in 180 BC, Cumae, which is a city in south of Rome along the Mediterranean, western Mediterranean coast, they had asked permission to change their official language to Latin. Now, they had spoken an old dialect called Oscan, O-S-C-A-N, and for most people, most common people, meaning people, rank and file folks who weren't elites, they kept speaking their native dialect of Oscan. But in terms of official government documents, diplomacy, government edicts, as well as any kind of commercial interactions and contracts and legal documents, all of that. So Latin became the language of government, administration, and commerce. So you kind of have a split between the working man who keeps his dialect and then the people who are running Cumae who want to be part of this growing political entity called Rome. And so it allowed, and this becomes kind of a method of incorporation that Rome is going to use much more frequently after this period of time, where they're going to ask for tribute. They're going to ask for a certain amount of loyalty of places that they've conquered, but they're going to kind of leave them alone to kind of manage their local affairs. You might even call it kind of the beginnings of what in America we call federalism, the idea that, think about this crisis that we're dealing with. It's not the president of the United States that's shutting our school down, it's the governor of Michigan. So that's an example of federalism at work. And so, Cumae would have been allowed for a certain amount of local autonomy and local control over matters that just dealt with them. But it's kind of a two-way street, because Cumae likes having the benefits of peace and prosperity and security that the Roman legions are going to provide them. And so this becomes kind of a new status of the Latin language, and it becomes kind of a unifying, binding force within the Italian peninsula. And so really by 100 BC, you've got the Latin language spreading to most of Italy, and then it's going to spread outwards, and the same kind of concept is going to be spread to Greece, to Carthage, to Iberia and Spain, and Greece, Macedonia, later Egypt, and of course the Middle East. So that is an important development. And last point, a censor by the name, and that was a Roman Republican official. A censor was kind of a government official who not only kind of kept, was basically in charge of regulating morality, but also documents and bookkeeping and things of that nature. His name was Sempronius Gracchus, and we're going to be reading about the Gracchi brothers later. They were political and economic reformers for the working class, but this might have been his grandfather or maybe their father, but Sempronius Gracchus began to register all foreign free men. Many of them had been flooding the Roman city as by virtue of their conquests. And if you would come to Rome and kind of get in line and ask for citizenship, they were granting it, but they were doing it as a single kind of immigrant tribe. And so these tribes would be granted political authority and political rights. And so they were granting them to non Roman immigrants, but that they were not being placed in multiple tribes, but just one single immigrant tribe, which would be typically outvoted or have less influence than like the 10 or 12 or 14 tribes that already existed. But again, it's another way of kind of expanding the notion of Roman citizenship as the republic is kind of bursting at the seams as we approach kind of the middle of the 2nd century BC. So that's all I have for tonight, or I guess you'll be watching it tomorrow, late morning, early afternoon. Keep working on those tests. Good luck to them, and you'll be responsible for this material, but just not now. Okay, so you'll be responsible for it for a later test. All right, God bless you, and we will see you on Wednesday. Thank you.